The National Bolivarian Armed Forces of Venezuela have raised their level of alert in response to the violent situation in the Colombian department of Arauca. The Chinese government has dismissed United States accusations that it is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. Palestinians celebrated the news of the release of Hisham Abu Hawash after 140 days of hunger strike against his detention without charges or trial by the occupying Israeli regime. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Katrina Goss. We begin in Venezuela, where the National Bolivarian Armed Forces have raised their level of alert in response to the violent situation in the neighboring northern Colombian department of Arauca. On Monday, Colombian Defense Minister Diego Molano confirmed that 23 people have been killed in the department amid fighting between illegal armed groups. Fighting broke out over the weekend as members of the National Liberation Army exchanged fire with dissidents of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Considering the severity of the situation and the statements made by President Ivan Duque seeking once again to lead Venezuela to these domestically driven events, Venezuelan Defense Minister General Vladimir Padrino rejected the accusations and confirmed that military forces were stationed in border municipalities to protect the Venezuelan people and national security. Colombia reached a historic high in public debt on Monday, which now represents over 60% of the country's gross domestic product. According to the most recent report by the Finance Ministry, the public debt of Colombia increased to over 380 million euros, representing a record 63.5% of GDP. According to the Treasury Office, of the total debt reported in November 2021, 40.2% corresponded to external debt, and the internal debt reached 39% of gross domestic product. The report also adds that Colombia's public debt increased during 2020 in view of the resources that had to be made available to meet the needs resulting from the pandemic. In view of this scenario, risk rating agencies have warned that a mechanism will be necessary to stabilize the debt obligation and avoid the default risk. In the framework of the launching of the Malvinas 40 Years Agenda, the Argentine Minister of Defense, Jorge Tayana, stated that the seizure of the Malvinas Islands by Britain 189 years ago was never accepted by any authority in Argentina and is therefore an illegal occupation.
We are also talking about the importance of regional integration. We are coming back hand in hand with Latin America. The unity of the region is what will give us the power and strength to stand up to the empire that maintains its colonial possessions. We are going to defend our rights, and we are going to defend our sovereignty through international law.
The Canadian government has announced an agreement in principle with the country's First Nations to compensate Indigenous children and their families who are harmed by discrimination and underfunding of the country's child welfare system. The deal is slated to end a human rights challenge that was launched 14 years ago. Approximately $20 billion will be used to pay compensation to victims, while the other $20 billion will be spent on reforming the system over 5 years. Under the agreement, First Nations children living on reserve and in the Yukon who were removed from their homes between April 1st, 1991 and March 31st, 2022 will be compensated along with their parents and caregivers. The preliminary agreement depends on the approval of Canada's Federal Court and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Canada has been rocked by a series of scandals regarding its treatment of Indigenous communities, with over 1,000 bodies of Indigenous children forced to attend boarding schools where abuse was rife, discovered last year.
The federal child welfare program was broken from the start. Most Canadians do not know this, that there was actually an incentive for child welfare agencies to remove children. In fact, a First Nations child welfare agency would not receive funding unless the child was removed from their home and placed into foster care. This historic settlement of $40 billion has been a long time coming. First Nations from across Canada have had to work very hard for this day to provide redress for monumental wrongs against First Nation children, wrongs fueled by an inherently biased system. We have a long way to go to address the poverty in our nations, and no amount of money will ever be the right amount, nor will it bring back a childhood lost. But today is about acknowledgement, about being seen and heard.
And we'll be right back after this very short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. The Chinese government has dismissed United States accusations that it is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal just a day after 5 world powers issued a rare joint statement pledging to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. A senior Chinese arms control official stressed the claims his government was dramatically increasing its nuclear capabilities were untrue, but noted that instead, steps are being taken to modernize Chinese nuclear forces in the interests of national defense. While the US Defense Department said in a report in November that China is expanding its nuclear force faster than previously predicted and could have more than 1,000 warheads by 2030, the fact is that the US has almost 4,000 nuclear weapons and remains the only nation to have used them in war. The Omnicom variant of COVID-19 is triggering a renewed surge of cases globally, with Europe alone recording nearly 500,000 new cases on Tuesday. Among the worst affected is the United Kingdom, where the Conservative government has faced widespread criticism of its mishandling of the pandemic. According to official figures, the country reported nearly 160,000 cases in the latest 24-hour period. Meanwhile, the French Public Health Agency reported over 67,000 new COVID-19 cases in the previous day. Germany's infection rate rose for the 5th consecutive day, up to more than 200,000, according to the Robert Koch Institute for Infectious Diseases. Mexico continues to roll out booster shots of COVID-19 vaccines to those aged over 60 amid a rise in infections caused by the Omnicom variant. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador acknowledged on Tuesday that the number of COVID-19 infections is on the rise again, but noted that this is no cause for alarm as hospitalizations and deaths remain stable thanks to vaccination, which has reached 90% coverage of the population. With 126 million inhabitants, Mexico has reported the 5th highest number of COVID deaths in absolute numbers, according to official figures. However, its death rate per million inhabitants is the 26th highest in the world. The first case of the Omicron variant was identified at the beginning of December, with a spike in cases observed since. The United Nations recognized the efforts made by the Cuban government and people in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. The representative of the UN Development Programme on the island, Maribel Gutierrez, noted that even in the midst of the hard economic conditions as a result of the blockade imposed by the United States, the Caribbean nation managed to prioritize health and welfare above economic interests. The country not only developed its own vaccines, which allowed it to inoculate more than 80% of the population, including children as young as 5 years old, but also provided assistance in the early and hardest stages of the pandemic by sending health workers around the world to attend to those affected by the virus. Brazil faced several crises throughout 2021. One of them was the collapse of the health system sparked by COVID-19 and its mishandling by President Jair Bolsonaro's government. Our correspondent Andre Vieira and Sebastian Soto bring us a recap of the pandemic's impact on the country.
Never have so many people died in Brazil as in 2021, the year that began with the collapse of the health system in Manaus and the emergence of a new variant, Gamma. There, those hospitalized for COVID-19 were able to breathe thanks to oxygen donated by the government of Venezuela and the mobilization of Brazilian artists. Vaccination against COVID-19 also began in January. Later investigations showed that the immunization was delayed due to the lack of response from the government of Jair Bolsonaro to the pharmaceutical companies. It's an absurd thing to do. With the time it took for the vaccine to arrive, many people could have been saved. Amid the high number of deaths due to COVID-19, which exceeded 4,000 in 24 hours, the Senate set up a parliamentary commission of inquiry in April. The work of these senators revealed, among many points, the corrupt practice in the purchase of vaccines and the use of humans as guinea pigs for experiments supported by President Jair Bolsonaro and his sons. The parliamentary commission denounced the current Brazilian president for having committed 10 crimes. Society wanted to know who was going to take responsibility for the worsening of the deaths, for this massacre that took place in Brazil, and why many of the deaths that we showed that could have been avoided were not prevented. This is the responsibility of many people. There are many accused, but it is mainly the responsibility of the President of the Republic, of this serial killer who has a compulsion to kill. Between June 2020 and June 2021, deaths from COVID-19 in Brazil increased tenfold, from 50,000 to half a million deaths from the disease in a one-year interval. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro and his government continue to embrace denialism inside and outside of Brazil. The masks work, they are against them. Distancing works, they are opposed to it. Vaccines work, and they boycott them as much as they can. And meanwhile, they are in favor of ineffective measures. They are in favor of the so-called early treatment, which is an outdated issue. Even the Ministry of Health itself, which had recommended it, stopped recommending chloroquine and ivermectin, for example. But the President of the Republic used the stage of the United Nations General Assembly to defend the so-called early treatment combo. Brazil ends 2021 as the country with the second highest number of COVID-19 deaths in the world, almost 620,000 since the beginning of the pandemic. The result of a genocidal policy. So in that sense, President Bolsonaro, together with his group, are fully responsible for the impact of the pandemic we are experiencing.
I voted for him, and I will not vote for him again, because I think that life should be respected, women should be respected, and he, to me, is ill-educated.
The country is on track to reach 70% of its population immunized in the coming days, and is seeing a fall in COVID-19 cases and deaths. On the other hand, the government of Jair Bolsonaro has created difficulties for the immunization of children.
André Vieira e Sebastião Soto, teleSUR, Rio de Janeiro, Brasil.
Anti-vaccine movements have emerged in Bolivia following the government's decision to impose restrictions on those who refuse to be vaccinated. Our correspondent Freddy Morales has the story.
The explosion of new coronavirus infections in the so-called fourth wave is accompanied by the emergence of sectors opposed to the vaccine and the new measures and restrictions. They infringe on the civil rights and fundamental freedoms of the Bolivian people, which are enshrined in the political constitution of the state.
We are upset, Brother Minister. We are not going to agree with the compulsory vaccinations. Brother Minister, we do not have the money to do a PCR test every 48 hours. Brother Minister, think about the indigenous peoples.
Teachers in rural areas have joined the anti-vaccination movement. The leading promoters of the campaign are evangelical churches, which claim that getting vaccinated demonstrates a lack of faith. Now they are also resorting to the courts in rejection of 2 decrees that make it compulsory to present a vaccination card or proof of a negative PCR test for all public and private procedures. As churches, we have decided not to abide by any decrees, the law. The government has warned that the country is facing the beginning of the so-called fourth wave, with the proliferation of infections never before recorded. Vaccination remains voluntary. Vaccination is not compulsory, and those who exercise the right not to be vaccinated must also exercise their duty not to carry new variants, not to infect people who have already been vaccinated. In the first wave, the mortality rate was 6.2%. In the second and third waves, it dropped to 2%. And in the current fourth wave, it is still less than 1%. What would have happened to Bolivia if we have had this number of cases without vaccination? It would have been the biggest mortality catastrophe. Like in the first wave, we would have had problems burying our people. We would have to dig mass graves, as in Beni, with tractors, to bury our population in mass graves. We are not seeing this despite having many more cases. This is the result of vaccines. The government, within the framework of a new preventive measures, determined that a vaccination certificate or PCR test valid for 48 hours must be presented for any procedure in the public or private administration. Vaccination is free of charge, and there are sufficient doses for the entire population over 5 years of age.
Freddy Morales, teleSUR, Bolivia.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Palestinians celebrated the news of the release of Hisham Abu Hawash after 140 days on hunger strike against his detention without charges or trial by the occupying Israeli regime. Hawash, aged 40, agreed to end his hunger strike this Tuesday after Israel committed to his release by February 26th, according to his lawyer. The International Committee of the Red Cross, whose medical teams visited the Palestinian prisoner over the weekend, warned he was in a critical condition and called for a solution to prevent his death. The married father of 5 from Dura, in the south of the Israeli-occupied West Bank, is being held under administrative detention, an internationally condemned Israeli practice of arresting Palestinians for renewable 6-month terms without allowing them to view the charges or evidence against them. South African investigators on Tuesday handed over the first instalment of a long-awaited report into state corruption under former President Jacob Zuma. After 4 years' work with an investigation involving more than 300 witnesses, the first part of the corruption inquiry's report was handed over to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's vowed to root out graft and financial sleaze. The president described the event as a defining moment in the effort to definitively end the era of state capture and to restore the integrity of institutions. Ramaphosa said he would brief Parliament by the end of June on his response to the report, drawn up by a top-level commission, which does not itself have powers of prosecution.
State capture has damaged people's confidence in the rule of law, in public institutions, in law enforcement agencies, and even to some extent in the democratic process. That is what makes the work of this commission so essential. This report enables us to up our tempo in dealing with state capture, and I am sure that if we all work together, we will be able to rid our country of gross acts of corruption that we have seen in the past.
Despite the legal moves and pleas of human rights organization, San Diego on Monday became the second United States border city where federal officials restarted the Remain in Mexico program. The first returns from San Diego to Mexican soil are expected to happen on Tuesday or Wednesday. The widely criticized program, first implemented by the Trump administration in 2019, was halted after President Joe Biden took office. The U.S. courts ordered its reinstatement after the states of Texas and Missouri sued over the way the policy ended. The Biden administration has since used that ordered restart to expand the program to asylum seekers of additional nationalities, including Haitians. The re-implementation began in El Paso, Texas in December, and over 200 asylum seekers have since been returned to Ciudad Juarez, according to the UN Migration Agency, which tests returnees for COVID-19 and offers transportation to shelters designated by Mexican border officials. Mexican activists and officials announced that the guns killing thousands in the country every year are illegally trafficked from the United States. An estimated 500,000 illegal weapons enter the country each year, 70% of which come from the United States. In 2021, these weapons were involved in more than 17,000 murders. Last August, Mexico sued 11 U.S. gun companies for negligent business practices that encourage violence in the country. According to legal consultants to Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these businesses sell their weapons to whomever wants to purchase them, regardless of their subsequent use. In the first 36 months of the current administration, more than 100,000 homicides with firearms have been committed in Mexico. Sudanese protesters took to the streets of the capital, Khartoum, and other cities once again on Tuesday to reject the return to full military rule following the resignation of the Prime Minister earlier this week. Security forces fired tear gas to disperse protesters in several locations in the capital, including the area around the presidential palace, which has seen violent repression of protesters in previous mobilizations since the October 25th coup. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who was ousted by the military only to be reinstated a month later following a deal meant to calm tensions and under international pressure, stepped down on Sunday amid political deadlock, saying he had failed to find a compromise between the ruling generals and the pro-democracy movement. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For teleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.